Today we're going to zoom in a little bit and look at a more specific couple of laws that work together to reveal, again, I think God's heart on justice. And what we're going to see in continuity with last Sunday is, in fact, this economic theme continuing on. You see, God's idea of justice very much also connects to the idea of economics and how we spend our money, how we value our money, how we hold tight to it, how we treat others who maybe don't have a lot of money, how we treat the poor, the lowly, the oppressed. And we're going to see that play out today. In fact, this is why Jesus is able to give us this challenging verse. Before we jump into the law, we're going to start with some words of Jesus. Matthew chapter 19, verse 23, Jesus says this. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." Now, many of us maybe have heard this verse before. It's kind of a popular verse, a little well-known, and maybe you've heard different messages on it, and someone said, hey, this eye of the needle is actually a certain gate that's in Jerusalem, the city. That's not actually true. Jesus is saying that it's quite impossible. He'll go on to say, with man, things are impossible, but with God, all things are possible. But Jesus makes an interesting point. Now, we hear it and we think, okay, that sounds pretty good. That sounds right. We've heard that before. But to the people hearing Jesus say this was a revolutionary idea. You see, in their mind, these Jews that would have heard Jesus speaking, in their mind, if you are rich, if you are healthy, if you are in the top class of society, therefore that means that God is blessing you, which therefore that means that you are righteous, and that's why God is blessing you. Meanwhile, they thought the exact opposite about the poor. Well, if you're poor, if you're unhealthy, if you're sick, if you're hurting, if you're a servant, then God must be cursing you, judging you, because of some sin in your life or some sin in your parents' life or somewhere down the family line. God is looking down and cursing you and causing you to be where you are, so you are unrighteous. This is how they viewed it. And so when you would have asked them, hey, who's going to be first in line to the kingdom of heaven? Who's going to be right there in the front ready to go in? They would have quickly said, the rich, because they're righteous. And so when Jesus says this, hey, it's actually going to be quite difficult for the rich to make it in, this would have kind of blown their minds a little bit. Hold on, Jesus, what are you talking about? See, Jesus would challenge the idea that the rich are blessed by God and the poor are cursed by God. Jesus challenges that idea many times. You see, Jesus spoke about money quite often, really more often than we would like to care to admit. And he's not always just talking about how to spend our money, but sometimes he's talking about the role that money plays in our life, because money is of great value. And when we hold tight to it and we don't live generously, when we look down upon someone else because they don't have a lot of money or resources, our money can reveal the condition of our heart. And so Jesus says it's a challenge. It's difficult for a rich person, because a rich person has access to these resources, access to this money. And how they spend it, how they care for someone else, how they perhaps share it, reveals how they love their neighbor. See, Jesus knows that these ideas are intertwined, interconnected, as we're going to see as we play out the law. How we spend our money, how we prioritize how we spend, and how we help others, and how we treat those that maybe don't have it, reveals in our heart how we love God and how we love our neighbor as ourselves. So today's message, I believe, just like last Sunday, will be a little challenging for us once again. I hope that's okay with you. But we're going to look through what God has to say about justice in the law. Before we read here in Deuteronomy, I want us to just picture this idea, these two concepts that we're going to see the tension play out today. And the two concepts is self-preservation, preservation of self, and the preservation of the society. Preservation of self and preservation of the society. These two ideas are in tension, and we all are going to live with them. Now, we all innately as humans have this self-preservation kicked in. Right? A psychologist might call it fight or flight. When something goes wrong, you might jump into fight to protect yourself, or you might flee, run away, flight to protect yourself. Both are this idea of self-preservation. We need to do whatever we can do to make sure that we are good, that I am good. It's kind of built into who we are. And it kind of works its way out a little bit to our families. Self-preservation can also include them, me and my people, right? Me and the ones that look like me and the ones that I care about, me and the ones that are close by. This idea of self-preservation. But if we're not careful, what self-preservation can end up leading us to is selfishness, is greed. And this is some of the challenge that we're going to be faced with today. Versus the idea of self-preservation of this society. Now, how does this actually look? I want to give a great example. If y'all would just hop in a time machine with me, we're going to travel back a couple years. Everybody remember where they were in the springtime of 2020? Everybody remember? COVID. COVID hit the world and we didn't know what to do. The world went a little crazy during the springtime of 2020. Now, I realize as I'm speaking to this crowd, there could be a variety of ways that you responded to COVID, and I'm not here today to debate you on those. But nevertheless, it was a pretty crazy time. A lot of churches stopped meeting. Schools shut down. People that had jobs, maybe they found out they weren't essential all of a sudden, and they didn't have a job anymore. Or maybe they started to work from home. A lot of crazy things started to happen in springtime, right? March, April, May of 2020. Now, of course, the most crazy thing I remember, if you can think back, is this shortage on toilet paper. Okay, now we're all remembering this toilet paper shortage of 2020. It's a big deal. Now, I remember hearing this on the news, and man, the toilet paper's gone. Now, obviously, with COVID, we all had to go to the bathroom like twice as much or something. I'm not quite sure. But we were all home. So no one was at school, no one was at work, no one was out. And so our toilets at our house are getting extra work because we're all home. We're probably eating candy and bad food. Maybe that's just me. But the toilets are getting extra work and everybody needs their toilet paper. We're all family here. It's okay to talk about toilet paper. Now, with this shortage, this caused a few interesting things to happen. Now, I saw this on the news. Maybe you saw it on the news as well. I saw it live as well. People would come out of the store, Sam's Club or Costco, and what did they have? A mountain of toilet paper. You remember this? They'd come out with just an 84 pack and another 84 pack and then 120 pack. And here they're coming out of Costco holding their toilet paper because there's a shortage. Now, if this was you, just don't raise your hand. But I saw this a lot, and you probably did too. There was a shortage on toilet paper, so that means you had to get a lot. This is self-preservation. They might run out, so I need to have it. So I got to get a lot. Self-preservation. Now, there were also people during that same time that because there was a toilet paper shortage, it led them to get less toilet paper. Same reason. There's a shortage, but they thought, you know what, there's a shortage, so I need to get less so that there's more for other people. And some of your minds were just blown. Whoa, that's a revolutionary idea. This is the difference between self-preservation and the preservation of society. The same causation of there being a shortage can cause some people to get more and others to get less. And it's thinking of yourself. I need to make sure I have enough. Some people still have toilet paper in their closet now from 2020, I'm sure. While others are like, you know what, there's a shortage, so I should get less to make sure that someone else can get more. This is the tension that we see in justice revealed through the law, and we're going to see it play out even today. Self-preservation versus preservation of society. Today we're getting into Deuteronomy. We were there a little bit last Sunday in Deuteronomy. If you remember, this is the 5th book of the Bible, literally translates as the second law, Deuteronomy. And it's not a new and improved law that God already gave his people in Leviticus. This is rather a reminder. Hey, don't forget the law. To just catch us up, Deuteronomy takes place at the very end of God's people wandering in the wilderness. Right, the story of Moses, they're led out of captivity, out of Egypt, into the wilderness where they then roam, it says, for 40 years, a whole generation. And during that time is when God gave them the law. Here's the 10 Commandments, here's the 613 laws, here's the dietary codes, here's the rules for the tabernacle, here's all this stuff God gives them in the wilderness. And then Deuteronomy takes place at the end of this story, the end of this journey, when they're about to step into the promised land. God had said, I'm giving you a land that's going to be yours, right? This would eventually become Jerusalem, their capital city. They're about to step into the nation, the city, the kingdom, and be their people. And Deuteronomy is all about God saying, hey, don't forget the law I've given you. I want you as a nation to be set apart. That's the word holy. Holy means set apart. I want you to be holy and set apart that you can represent me to the other nations. That's why we're going to look so different. Be a peculiar people. That's why they had all the laws, all the dietary restrictions, all the ceremonies, all the sacrificial system. All this was so they could stand apart from the rest of the nations and display what God is like to them. And so Deuteronomy is this reminder, hey, this is the type of people I want you to be. Don't forget. So today as we read through Deuteronomy, typically what we do here, we'll read the passage all the way through and then go back through. I've decided we're going to do a little bit different today. So we're going to look at the verses from Deuteronomy chapter 24, 10 all the way down to 22, but we're going to look at a few at a time. And unlike last week, we're actually not going to skip any this time. So we're going to go consecutive all the way through. Are we ready for Deuteronomy? I got an amen. Thank you, Roland. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 10. When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledge as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you. And it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord your God. Talking about loans. Now, if you can remember all the way back to last Sunday, we talked about loans a little bit last Sunday. And the challenging idea God gave us then was that in their loans, he said, hey, don't charge them interest. Which again, I amen that. Maybe you want to amen that if you're thinking about all your interest payments you've got going on. God says, I don't want my people to be charged interest. Because what does interest cause? It causes the rich to get richer because they're making money on their money, and it causes the poor to get poorer. They're paying money on their lack of money. This is what God says is not just. And so he challenges us, this was last Sunday, to not charge interest. Now today we're going a different direction, but God's still talking about loans. He says when you give a loan to someone, don't go into their house to gather their pledge. So what's going on here? When you make a loan to somebody, they're going to give you something back. This is what they call a pledge here. We might call it collateral. If I want to take your car and drive it around the block, okay, I'm going to leave with you my laptop computer or the key to my house, or I'm going to leave with you something of value so that you're going to trust that when I drive around the block, I'm going to come back and give you your car back. This is what a pledge is. This is what collateral is. So the interesting rule that God gives us here is that when I give someone a loan, they're going to give me their pledge. So we go to their house to get the pledge, but God says what? Don't go in. Don't go in the house. Now, why is this? You see, when I get to their house, if I go in the house, me, the loan giver, I'm going to start looking around and maybe I see a nice lazy boy recliner and I'm thinking, that sounds like a good pledge to me. That pledge would look great in my house, in fact. I think that should be the pledge. Or you know what? Actually, as I'm looking around, I'm starting to see you have quite a lot of nice stuff. Maybe I don't need to give you a loan at all. Maybe you need to sell some of these other things. What it does is it places me, the loan giver, in a position of power over the one who's receiving the loan. And this is the challenge, the idea that God pushes back against. That we don't consider ourselves better, greater, closer to God in any way because we, in this instance, are the loan giver and they are the loan receiver. So it says, hey, stand outside, let them go in. They're going to go find whatever item it is that's going to be their pledge. They're going to come back out to you and say, here's my pledge. Now, at that point, you can reject the pledge if you'd like and say, I need something bigger or different. That's fine. But you're leaving with them their dignity as they go into their own house, their own sanctuary, where they have their own security, and they're going to choose their own pledge to give to you. See, we're going to talk a little bit today about dignity. We're going to see that dignity and justice are very much tied together as we see God revealed in the law. Don't go in their house. Stay out. Let them go in. Get the pledge and come out. It's not you overstepping in a position of power and taking authority in the situation to say, I'm going to come in and I'm going to pick a pledge and it's going to be this, or you need to sell that. It's putting you in the position of power that God says you don't have to be. And in fact, God challenges the idea a little more in verse 13. He says, if they are poor, don't keep their pledge longer than another day. See, a lot of times the poor, when they would give their pledge, when they would want to get a loan, they would take off their cloak, kind of their safety blanket, if you will. Take off their cloak, give you their cloak, and this is their pledge. What God says is, hey, they need that. Now, maybe it's your right to have it. You gave them a loan, now it's my cloak. I'm going to hold it until I get paid back. God says, you know what? Their dignity is more important than your right to get your loan back, your pledge back. Their dignity is more important than that. So a poor person that needs their cloak for that evening, it says, don't keep it past the sun going down. Give it back to them. Let them have it because they need their dignity. God says, in fact, this is counted righteous to you, the end of verse 13. We are to care about the poor. This, again, reveals our heart. And God cares about what? Our heart. We talk about this often. Moving forward, verse 14. You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day, before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. Now maybe you hear this verse and you're thinking, sweet, I'm kind of exempt from this. I'm not anyone's boss. I don't choose how much people get paid, so I'm kind of exempt from this. No, I want us to see the principle of it and how it actually will affect us, because all of us have someone that we influence in our life, a friend, a family, children, a spouse. Maybe it is people at work. Maybe you are actually in that position of the boss and you have the employees. God challenges these bosses in this time to say, do not take advantage of your hired workers. Again, show them dignity. He gives an interesting challenge. He says, hey, pay them before the day's over. Pay them before they go home. See, oftentimes what would happen, you have someone that's going to work for you, and you're going to kind of withhold the money over here. And maybe they didn't do it right. Maybe you need to fix this. Maybe you need to work another day. Maybe I'm going to call immigration services on you so you get in trouble before I ever have to pay you. These are things that happen. God says, no. This poor person that's working for you, you owe them that money that day. Pay it to them that day. Don't let them go home and wonder if they're going to get it. Don't let them go home and not be able to provide for themselves. Because a lot of these poor people, when they go home, they need that money that they earned that day to pay for the dinner for that night so that their family can eat. Maybe they need to pay their landlord that night. God says, don't take advantage of someone's dignity by withholding from them their wages. Treat them fairly. Give them what they've earned. Don't withhold from them. And in fact, it gets very interesting at the end here where he says, hey, listen, verse 15, you shall give him his wages on the same day, lest he cry out against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. That sin comes back on us if someone that we have influence over, if someone that's in our sphere of our life, if they cry out against us that we are treating them unfairly, if we are treating them unjustly, if they cry out against us, guess what? God hears their cry. Think about the people of God in Egypt. They had the oppressors from Egypt, the slave masters, and they cried out to God, and he says he heard their cry, and he listened to them and had compassion on them. In the same way, the people that work for us, the people that are in our sphere of influence, when they cry out against us, guess what? God hears that, and we ourselves become guilty of sin, of not loving our neighbor as ourselves. You see, once again, this principle pushes the idea that I, as the boss, am not any more important or valuable than the employee. The CEO is not better than the janitor. The boss is not better than the worker. These are principles that we can still take today. We shouldn't treat the CEO any different than we treat the janitor. We shouldn't treat the boss any different than we treat the employee. Both are equal in God's eyes. Both have value simply because they are humanity. We talked about this week one, the Imago Dei, made in God's image. Humanity has value simply because they are humanity. Moving on, verse 16. Fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. Now maybe you're thinking, wow, that's a harsh verse thrown right in the middle of this justice series here. But this is in fact a very important verse for us. See, what would have been true in this time is that people would have been liable for the sins of others, especially their family members. And if me as a father, if my child did something that brought upon this penalty, I could be guilty of death myself. I'm thankful that that's not still a thing. I'm thinking about my kids and what they might do. And in the same way, for a child, you might be punished because of something your father or your mother, your grandfather did, and now you're liable to their guilt. It's put upon you, and you could be put to death. You could be punished because of the guilt of your father, because of the guilt of your son, because of the guilt of someone in your family. This was a true statement for the day and age in which this was written. And this is an important step to say, no, you are going to be liable and guilty for your own decisions, your own autonomy. This is an important step, in fact, in human civilization. You see, oftentimes in this day and age, people were guilty of other people's sins that were put upon them. Now, if you can remember, I want us to see the beauty of the step in the right direction towards Jesus with this. A few weeks ago, we talked about Lamech. Y'all remember Lamech from Genesis 4? This is one of the descendants of Cain. Cain, one of the children of Adam and Eve. Cain rises up and kills his brother Abel. Then Cain moves, is cast out from the area, the land of Eden, goes east, and he establishes a city. And the city is established in the principles of violence and war and greed and power. this path of humanity opposing the path of God. One of the descendants of Cain is this man named Lamech. And in Genesis 4, Lamech says, hey, if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, Lamech's is going to be 77-fold. As if to say, if you harm me, I'm going to harm you back way worse. If you kill one of my animals, I'm going to kill 77 of yours. If you harm one of my family members, I'm getting 77 of yours. This became the routine of civilization, and the violence exploded exponentially throughout the face of the earth. And violence begat violence, and it was just a hellscape. And this is when God looks in on Genesis chapter 6 and says, I regret making humanity. And then he brings about the flood of Noah, cleansing the earth of this intense violence. This was the way of the world. And when Moses steps in with the law, you remember the law of Moses, quite important. It says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You've heard this verse? This is in, I made a note, this is in Leviticus. Where are we at? Leviticus 24:20. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a cut for a cut, a burn for a burn, a scrape for a scrape. There's all these listed out. And you're thinking, man, this is still a challenge. But this is a step in the right direction. Because at first it was, man, I could get someone back way worse. And now when the law of God comes, it's going, hey, no, one for one. You are responsible for your actions one for one. If they hurt you, you hurt them back. If they do this to you, you do this back. And you're thinking, well, is that the final step in this revelation of God? Well, you're correct, it's not. See, what happens is we take this one step from Lamech to the law of Moses. We take another step from the law of Moses to Jesus. Jesus who comes to fully reveal God, and Jesus who would reference this law of Moses, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and say, I know you've heard that law, but I say, God says, in fact, turn the other cheek if someone slaps you on the right cheek. He says, love your enemy, forgive those who've persecuted you, pray for your enemies. Jesus would challenge us even further to say, no, this is in fact truly the heart of God, but I want us to see this law as a step in the right direction, though it's not the final step. So it goes from exponential violence to one for one to let's forgive and love our enemies. But this law is quite important in here that, no, you can't be put to death for someone else. That's unjust. You can be put to death for your own sins. You're punishable by your own sins, your own decisions. Verse 17, you shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. These two verses are in a lot of ways a summation of all of the rules we're looking at today and the ones we saw last Sunday. Do not pervert justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless or to the widow. This example we're going to see in a moment, these lists of the ones of the most vulnerable of society. The sojourner, that's the immigrant, the traveler, the foreigner. The fatherless, this is the orphans. The widows, the ones whose husbands and securities have passed away, that are left with oftentimes nothing. The most lowly, vulnerable ones of society are mentioned here. God says, don't pervert justice that is due to them. I want us to see what this says today. Justice is due to them. See, as humanity, as I said, we're valuable simply because we are humans, created in God's image. And because of that, we have self-worth, we have dignity. Justice is due to us, not because we work to earn it, not because we're good enough to receive it, but because we are humans made in the image of God. And God says here that this justice is due to these people because they are people. It's due to them. They don't have to earn it or work to achieve it. We don't have to hold them to a standard to say, oh, you hadn't quite earned my justice yet, my fairness yet, my dignity yet. No, we ought to give it to them because they are people. We don't look down upon them because they are people. It says it this way. This is in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 15. It says this, you shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. But in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. I want us to jump back and see that in Leviticus because it's all about how we treat and give dignity and respect and care for the poor. And the example in Leviticus there is about what happens in court. Now, I know oftentimes here in Castle Rock, as I look around Castle Rock, people have a lot of the stuff that they want, that they need, possessions. People have nice houses and nice cars and nice stuff, generally. But one thing that I've noticed as I've looked around, I'm in quite a few Facebook groups with a lot of local people, and if I don't see a post almost every single day about divorce. Sadly, I see this happening time and time again. Struggle in relationship, whether it's between parents and kids or between one another, spouses, and there's posts about divorce. And sadly, too, what I see is people that are going, hey, I need to get a great divorce attorney because my wife or my husband has a great one, and they're going to win all the stuff and get the kids and get the house and get the possessions, and I'm going to be left with nothing. There's this worry. Maybe you've experienced this before. This is a perversion of justice, to have one lawyer that's better, that works the system and finds the loopholes and takes advantage of the other who can't afford as nice of a lawyer. We see this work out in our own justice system today. People who are rich can afford the best lawyers to get them out of the trouble. People who are poor oftentimes may be assigned a lawyer if they can't afford one, and it's not quite equal. And the poor are taken advantage of. All this theme is about not taking advantage of someone else. Having dignity, not seeing yourself as better than them because you're the one that has the money. You're the one that has the better lawyer. You're the one that's the boss. No, we're not better intrinsically than anyone else. We are equal before God in his eyes as his beloved children whom he loves and gives value, whether you're rich or whether you're poor. But it is the rich who have this added responsibility of how I'm going to steward this money that I have, these resources that I have. You see at the end of verse 18 it says, but you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. God reminds them of this several times, in fact. We're going to see it in the next verse, and we saw it even a few times last Sunday. Hey, don't forget, you were slaves, God tells his people. As you're beginning your new society, as you're stepping into the promised land, don't get into this place where you think you've arrived and you've got it all figured out, and you're good to go, and there's no problems, and you can do what you want. Hey, don't forget where you've come from, is what God is saying. Don't forget that you once were a slave in the land of Egypt, and I, God, rescued you out of it. Don't forget. In fact, this is a very important theme that we need to understand as Christians today. We are Christians not because we've got it all figured out and we don't ever mess up and we're perfect. Far from it. We're Christians because we found grace and forgiveness from God. We know that we sin. We know that we mess up. We confess this to the Lord, but we receive grace and compassion from the Lord. And because of this, we ought to give it away. We ought to share it with those that need it. Because we have been forgiven of much, we ought to forgive others of much. This is the principle that starts right here and goes all the way into the New Testament and all the way to us. Don't forget where you've come from. Don't look upon someone who comes into the church for the first time or someone who's just trying to question Jesus for the first time and go, man, they don't have it all figured out. Man, they don't know what they're saying. Man, I can't believe they still do those things. Don't forget where you came from, where God has rescued you out of. Remember that. That's what he tells them. Don't forget you were slaves in Egypt. So treat the poor with dignity. Don't have slaves. Don't treat people as lower class citizens because that once was you. And the same is true for us. Hey, don't forget where you've come from. God has forgiven you of much, therefore you ought to forgive others as much. Let's close it up here, verse 19. These next few verses may end up being the most challenging for all of us, so buckle up. When you reap your harvest in your field, and you forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I, God, command you to do this. God challenges the people, and I believe he's challenging us with this last passage here. He reminds them once again, you were slaves in the land of Egypt, so remember what I'm commanding you. And now as you go about and live your daily lives, don't forget these principles. And so he says, hey, when you're in your field, now let's remember here, this is their field. I bought the field, I own the land, I worked the land, I planted the food, I got the equipment to grow the food, I hired the laborers to gather the food. It's my field, it's my food. God gives 3 examples challenging that. In fact, it says it this way in Leviticus 23:22, same principle. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. God says, when you're in your field and you're about to plow and gather the harvest, don't go all the way to the edge. Come in a little bit. Leave the edge. When you're walking towards the edge, towards the corner of the field, you know what? Just kind of round it off. Turn it a little rounded. Leave those corners, leave those edges. Leave that, because that is for the poor. That is for the hungry. That is for the fatherless, the widow, the sojourner, the orphan. That is for them. That is not yours. When you leave a sheaf, what's a sheaf? Right, when you gather the barley, gather the grain, you'd wrap it up into these bundles and you call them sheaves that then you'd end up taking away to the threshing floor to be separated. But you'd gather these sheaves and you'd gather them and throw them on the back of a donkey. You gather them yourselves and you walk. Now, if you happen to leave the field and you forget one, my sheaf. If you forget your sheaf, God says it's not yours anymore. Leave it. That sheaf is for the poor. And you're thinking, but that's my sheaf. That's my food. I made it. I grew it. God says it's not yours anymore. He gives two more examples about olives and grapes. When you go to the olive tree and beat the tree, right? You hit the tree so the olives fall down. You gather them together. He says, once you do that once, stop. Don't do it again. Don't go back through and beat it more. Whatever's left behind is not for you anymore. It's for the poor. And the same for grapes. When you strip the vines to get the grapes, strip it once. Don't go back and strip it again. Leave that there for the poor, for the sojourner, for the fatherless, for the widow. God gives these examples. We see it 3 times in a row. Sojourner, fatherless, widow. It's not just them, but it's them representing the lowest of the society. Leave it behind for the poor. See, this principle can certainly challenge us because it's not quite fair if we think about it in our understanding of fairness. It's not quite capitalistic. Capitalism, and again, we talked about this last Sunday. Capitalism says you want to gather as much as you can. I need to get all the grapes. I need to get all the olives because I can collect them and then have them for myself to store or to sell to make more money to plant for the next year. It's a good business principle. I'm not challenging that. But this idea of God's justice pushes back up against what we might call fair. As I've said before, God is not after fairness. He's after justice. And your field, as you walk through it, God says you're going to have a lot that you're going to leave behind. Even though it's yours, it's not belonging to you. It's not for you. It's for them. Now, maybe you're thinking, okay, well, this is all fine for me. I'm not a farmer, so it's all good. We don't have the same society today as they did back then, of course, and we're less agriculture. For most of us, we aren't farmers. Most of us, we live in a monetary society. When you leave work at the end of the week, at the end of the month, you get paid not in barley and cows. No, you get paid in money, right? Hopefully that's the case for you. We get paid in money. And so what does this have to do with us? This is where I believe it gets really challenging for us. You see, the way a lot of the poor in our society today, they don't walk through the field and gather from the corners, but a lot of the poor in our society today, if we're honest, are helped out through a lot of government social programs. Welfare, WIC, Women in Crisis. There's many different social programs and nonprofits and ministries that help provide for the poor. And a lot of these ones, especially the ones through the government, are provided for through what? Right? I learned a long time ago the government doesn't make money on their own. At least they're not supposed to. They make money through our taxes. Our taxes go, and remember your first paycheck? I remember that first paycheck. They look at it and they go, who the heck is IRS? And who's getting all my money? Right? I remember this, looking at my first paycheck. We nowadays pay taxes. And now I'm not here today, please don't hear this. I'm not here today to try to convince you on taxes and which side of the political aisle you should be on and that the system of taxes can never be corrupted. No, I'm not here to tell you that. But what I am here to tell you is the principle behind it. Taxes are taken out of our check, my money. I earned it, it's mine. Taxes are taken out of it to go to social programs that often provide for the poor of our society. How do we feel about those taxes coming out? Because it's very eerily similar to God saying, don't go to the edge. Cut the field off. Don't go back and pick up that sheaf. Don't strip those olive branches, those grapevines again. Leave those because they're for someone else. It's not for you, it's for someone else. This challenge sits before us. And for today, we're not worried about our fields. Today, we're looking at our taxes. Now, maybe you think, dadgummit, the government shouldn't be doing it, the church should. And to that I say, amen. The church should be doing more, certainly. Many churches will spend their money in inappropriate ways, certainly. Some churches are just struggling to pay the bills themselves. The last statistics put it's well under 10% of people that actually tithe to the church, which is God's plan. People that give the 10% to the church so that the church can carry out the ministry. If everybody tithed in the church could be paying for everybody's medical bills and dental bills and food bills and paying for their gas. And all. The church could be doing a lot more if the people were providing for the church as God intended. Yet here we are where the government brings a lot of this assistance. And then we have the audacity to get mad about our money going to someone else to pay for them in their time of need. Because guess what? It's not fair. I understand the tension of the principle. I think you should work hard and earn your money. I think you should work hard and grow what you have. I think you should steward it well. But what it doesn't mean is that there's not something that's yours that belongs to someone else. Just because it's yours doesn't mean it belongs to you. This is the principle God institutes in this field. Just because it's yours doesn't mean it's for you. It might be for someone else that needs it. This is the tension between fairness and justice as we see in the Bible. Justice is how we love one another, how we love our neighbors as ourselves. It's easy to love yourself. It's easy to provide and care for yourself. It's easy to gather all that you can and hold it on tight to yourself. That's why it's hard that Jesus says for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God, because they want to hold everything because it's theirs, it's mine. When rather God calls us to live with open hands. Might we be able to trust God in this challenging principle of our life? To say, hey, just because it's mine, maybe it's not for me. Maybe God has an idea that's to use it a little bit bigger of a way to care for and provide for those that don't have anything. Whether it's their fault or not. I hear the wheels turning in your head, but they're lazy. But they didn't work hard. Why don't they get a job? I hear you. I hear you. But between us and God, between you and God, is our heart and how we ought to represent him to others by being generous ourselves. Not worrying about what's between them and God, how they spend it, what they do with it while they're in the predicament, but rather, can we be generous ourselves with what we have? This is justice in the law. And it's not easy. But can we be the people that represent God, not through trying to be fair and hold on to what's mine, but can we understand that God is after economic justice, caring for the ones that don't have anything, and he institutes it through his law. And so as we see Jesus further fulfill the law, and Jesus says, you know what, all this law depends on what? If we love our neighbors as ourselves, if we love God with all of our heart. And so for us, how can we love our neighbors as ourselves? We don't look down upon them because they're poorer than us. We don't think we're better than them because we're richer than them. We understand they have value and they have dignity, and we ought to treat them in such a way. I pray that we can be that kind of people. Though the challenge is there, I understand. But that we can say, you know what, I'm going to trust God with this. I'd rather go to the edge of my field, right? But I'm going to trust God with that. I'd rather go back and beat the olive tree again twice and get all the olives, but I'm going to trust God with that. For you, I pray that you trust God with your resources. Whether it's money or your home or how you steward, whatever it is, I pray that you trust God with your resources and trust that his plan is better than yours. When we don't understand it, that we give it to God. That's the challenge before us, and I pray we can be those type of people. Amen and amen.